on August 19th at approximately 3 p.m. And that homicide was initially, the call was into our dispatch center to check the welfare of a male who was lying in front of a couple of businesses, actually lying between the King's Smoke Shop and Metro PCS, and that was at 3614 East Belmont, again on August 19th at 3 p.m. The officers arrived at that location and located a 38-year-old victim by the name of Miguel Arnulfo Garcia. He was lying in between these two businesses. He was bleeding profusely, and officers provided CPR and then transported him to CRMC. Again, he was pronounced deceased at that location. Doctors determined that he had a stab wound that had penetrated the heart. There were no witnesses at the scene. Detectives did an incredible job of canvassing the neighborhood, trying to locate anyone that had information regarding this case, locating businesses to see if they had any helpful video, and also checking a video policing camera that was nearby. And that did provide the information that we needed. It was that video that ultimately allowed our detectives to identify witnesses in the area that we were able to then interview, as well as a vehicle that was seen leaving the area. That vehicle ultimately was a suspect vehicle. And through, again, some good investigative work, they were able to determine the license plate of that vehicle, and as well as the person who was driving that vehicle. And that led investigators to the identification of 46-year-old Michael Leyva of Fresno, and he was identified a few days prior to August 29th. What our investigators determined was that Leyva had went to the business. He was involved in a disturbance with Garcia, the victim. So suspect Leyva and victim Garcia were involved in a disturbance, and that was right in front of Metro PCS. That verbal argument turned physical, and at that time, that's when Leyva pulled out a knife and stabbed victim Garcia one time in the chest. The vehicle, or Leyva, then got into the vehicle and fled the area. The vehicle was recovered, suspect vehicle was recovered on September 28th, and detectives also served a search warrant at a residence where Leyva was staying in central Fresno, recovered several knives. We're hoping that one of those knives that ultimately is determined to be the murder weapon. Our detectives began working very, very closely with Leyva's girlfriend, who was very cooperative in this case. We want to thank her for that cooperation, because it was ultimately that cooperation with our homicide detectives that allowed us to locate Leyva. And so on Saturday, our detectives were led to a Motel 6 in the northwest Fresno area. Again, that information was provided by Leyva's girlfriend. Detectives made contact with Leyva, who was inside of a hotel room, and ultimately he came outside with his hands up and surrendered to the detectives. That was 6 p.m. on Saturday, September 1st. Leyva has been booked into Fresno County Jail for murder. And what's interesting is that Leyva has a prior arrest and prior conviction. That prior conviction was for a case in 1991, and it too was for a stabbing where he murdered an individual. Ultimately, he pled to a manslaughter case, and he was sentenced to 11 years in prison. Somehow he did not do the 11 years in prison, because 5 years later he was out in society and was being rearrested for other types of felony cases. So again, Leyva is being booked, or has been booked, into Fresno County Jail and charged with one count of murder. With that, any questions? Pretty straightforward case. Good work by our detectives. Homicide Detective Markey is the primary on that.